Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR 96.3, 96.3 HD2, and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Bramante Bryant in for Harold Fisher. This is the Insight segment. Gen Zs, fresh out of college and into the workplace. A new report says many employers are having second thoughts about hiring Gen Zers, and in some cases, are already giving them the boot. Are Gen Zers getting a bad rap, or are the employers old and out of touch? Gen Zers, HR experts, and college counselors are sounding off on the topic tonight. Joining us, Dr. Sonia Ford. She's Wellness Center Director at a major university. Sean Talley. He's an HR expert. Monique Small. She is a 26-year-old GenZ college graduate who's been in the workforce for a little over 3 years. And Esther Alexandre, 2023 college grad. She's working now for a defense company. Should be a very interesting conversation. We thank you all for being here tonight. Little couple fast facts we want to throw out before we begin. Intelligent.com, a platform dedicated to helping young professionals, surveyed about 1,000 employers who hired 2024 graduates. Here's what that survey found. 6 in 10 of those employers who hired college grads earlier this year have already fired them. 1 in 7 of those bosses say they may avoid hiring new grads altogether next year. 3/4 of the company said some or all of their recent graduate hires were unsatisfactory in some way. And 50% of those bosses pointed to Gen Zers being unprofessional, unorganized, and having poor communication skills. So for those of you who are confused, and I get that way sometimes about who falls into the Gen Z category, it's the generation born between 1997 and 2012. So in 2024, the oldest member of the Gen Z group would be in their late 20s, while the youngest would be around 12. And those are also called digital natives or born digital. So you got it. So there's a lot going on. So we're going to start this conversation with going to the Gen Zers and let them stand first. Monique,
Hello.
are you all getting a bad rap? Because you heard what I just rattled off there, and it wasn't really, it wasn't the best of descriptions of Gen Zers. So do you think the critique is fair, or are Gen Zers getting a bad rap today?
I definitely do think that we are getting a bad reputation. I believe so, especially specifically our generation. Um, I am a 2020 graduate from the University of Maryland College Park, and I think a lot of people forget, um, surprisingly, what happened in 2020, which was COVID. I had my last semester of college in COVID. I didn't get to cross the stage at all. I didn't have a graduation, and it took me maybe about, I graduated in May. I didn't get a job until maybe like, I think October or November. Um, I think you have to realize that we didn't really get job training and things of that nature because a lot of jobs were still figuring out how to be virtual. So a lot of my time, I just felt really just pushed to the side. I didn't necessarily get the training or attention that I deserved in regards to being newly admitted to the work field. A lot of college isn't necessarily about your professionalism. It's more so about turning in your assignments on time and, learning new information. And I definitely think those first few months in the job field are important, and we didn't really get that. A lot of jobs didn't become fully functionally virtual until maybe a year or two after COVID. By that time, I guess people are kind of expecting us to already have our stuff together. I think a lot of the college grads after 2020 had a little bit of a better plan, but 2020, I think we kind of really got a big impact from COVID. A lot of companies are expecting us to be 3-4 years in experience, but really and truly, can say I only really truly have a year and a half of job experience post COVID, and actually having my day to day and getting myself together. And I think that a lot of employers are not taking that into consideration.
That's such an important point about the situation with COVID, and I want to dive into that a little bit more. But I want to go over to Esther. So, Esther, when you hear this about Gen Zers being lazy, unprepared, lack of communication skills, difficult to work with, how does that make you feel? And again, is that a rare representation of you and your peers?
I want to say no, it's not a representation. I want to say one thing about Gen Z that we're resilient. We're able to see from our like parents from the older generation how they were treated in the workplace, and we kind of like know our worth and our value, and we're not gonna stand to like let ourselves go through that again. We value our mental health. We've put ourselves first because at the end of the day, at a company, you're statistic. Like they don't care if you're deteriorated from like the over workload. So Gen Z really stands for their self in terms of like when they're in any situation. And I want to say like there are, of course, there are going to be some bad apples in a bunch, like in every generation. But for me, especially as as an engineering student, as a working in the engineering field, I want to say that my peers that I work with, we make sure that we're putting our best foot forward. We network, we talk to our older generation because that's how we like learn about the company itself, how the ins and outs works. And I just want to say like I kind of feel like people harping in on like what they see on social media because social media has a huge impact on everything and like what's actually happening with the people.
Sonia, Esther, and Monique have hit some very good points from COVID to how Gen Zers see themselves as resilient, how they put their health first, how they're getting a bad rap. I've got two now that I kind of really remember what age they fall in. I have two Gen Zers, and there is something to Gen Zers that they look. I'm a baby boomer, and I'm right on the edge of baby boomer to what comes after boomer, Generation
Gen
X,
X.
Gen X. You see how these generations are. So I'm right on the cusp of each. Um, and it's just a whole different way of thinking. And I don't know if that's so odd. Maybe for each generation, we look at things differently. But for these Gen Zers, to what Monique and Esther are saying with COVID, missing graduations, right? Missing proms, missing that interaction with students. What kind of impact do you think that has had? And do we not give enough attention to that when we describe and again, this is a survey of only 1,000, right? So we don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but we're starting there. Is it an unfair description of Gen Zers with if we consider all that they've had to deal with, which many of us didn't as we were kind of coming up through this stage?
Bramante, I really think that it is it's very hard for these Gen Zers because of the way that we label them. And I think we need to give them grace. I really do. I have two of my own. And so I think that we really need to give them grace. We do have to remember, Monique brought up COVID. And they have lived through COVID as we all have. But when we think about, their developmental stage and what they're going through, the emotional stress and the grief from the pandemic, the educational challenges, how they had online learning, there wasn't a lot of social interactions during that time. We have to remember that for them. And there's a lot of anxiety that comes around communication. And it's because everything has been online. You mentioned digital natives, and they are digital natives. Social media, online activities indulge their lives. And so we have to take that into account. Esther mentioned mental health. I think that this generation really values self-care. They really value mental health. they're more willing to seek help. And I think that we have to remember that. So yes, it may be difficult for them to effectively communicate in the workplace. They have their own ideas of how life should go. You know, they're more into purpose as opposed to, you know, chasing those good feelings and getting those accolades. They make their health a priority. So I think that with the Gen Zers, sometimes we do give them a bad rap. As Esther said, there's, you know, bad apples in every bunch. But I do think we need to give them some grace when you think about their mental health, how they're really trying to take care of that.
Sean, you are a human resources expert. So you see all kinds of generations coming through the office, right? So you can sort of do your own comparative study. What have you seen in terms of Gen Zers and their approach to work? Because, you know, I've had personal experiences with family members who've had companies who say, man, these Gen Zers will, first of all, quit at the drop of a hat. Number two, oftentimes they don't really give a whole big hoot about hierarchy. They come in and say, look, I know what I know. And I mean, you may be the boss, but you know, this is what I know. Now, again, this is a generalization, but from your standpoint, seeing all of those generations come through, you know, human resources, what's your sense of Gen Zers?
I would like to, not that you need me to validate it, but everything that all these wonderful sisters have said is really spot on. I think there is kind of a micro approach to this and a macro approach. So the micro, looking specifically at these recent college grads, we've touched on it. So to be clear, college nor high school prepare you for work. They just don't. Now, if you're in a professional program in college, then perhaps you'll learn certain skills, but really surviving at work is all about those unwritten rules, right? And so specifically, those recent college grads that didn't get the opportunity to be in an office and be at the water cooler and watch how these people operate over here versus those people that get promoted versus those people that separate from the company. So they've lost those firsthand life experiences that you can't get virtually. So this recent group, they've been significantly affected by that in a negative way. On a macro level, what you essentially have is the clash of two generations, which is your baby boomers, Bramante, as well as these Gen Z. Gen X, we're just caught in the middle like we always do. But essentially, you know, the baby boomers, they came of age really in the excess of the Ronald Reaganomics 80s. You know, business, greed is good, all that. And then they started seeing people getting fired by the tens of thousands toward the end of the 80s into the 90s. So as Esther was saying, wait a minute, we've been seeing and hearing and reading about what happens when you give all your loyalty to an organization. So they started thinking about things like work-life balance. They've started thinking about corporate social responsibility, like what is this company into? You know, it matters who you're investing to and who you're in business with. And this group of people looks for mentors as well. And so organizations that are seeking to specifically go after Generation Z, you need to have that infrastructure in place to be able to support them. If you just want to bring them in and say, hey, go work at the same rules. And these are things like, you know, working late and timeliness and glorifying overwork, which was a good thing back in the baby boomers. Even Generation X, we were just polite to our parents, so we dealt with it. But like you said, Gen Z, they've seen enough and they're not having it. And the fact is they're changing things. This is their world. So I'm not wearing a tie. Baby boomers never would show up for something like this without a tie. I have a whole closet of ties. I don't have
Sean, you know, that is such an important point that you're making, because for me, coming up in this business, or folks who are watching us on the web, when I first started in this business, there was no way I would come on with an open collared shirt. I'd have a tie on. So there are changes, and they're affecting changes maybe that we don't even realize. So I think that's such an important point.
Here's the reality. Baby boomers are retiring.
Mm-hmm.
Soon the first wave of Gen Xers are retiring. Guess who's taking this over? So the
Well,
change is going to happen.
yeah. Well, look, I wish I was retiring, but I'm not there yet. But we're going to talk about that and much more. We're going to take a quick break. If you're on the line, you can hear every edition. Stay right there, not on the line. We're so used to taking phone calls, so muscle memory. But you can hear every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com, or you can download the 96.3 HD2 app on your smartphone and hear the program live in its entirety. This conversation will continue online and on SiriusXM channel 141, 96.3 HD2. The original Quiet Storm is next on 96.3 WHUR. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on SiriusXM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2. I'm Bermonte Bryant in for Harold Fisher. This is the Insight segment. Tonight we were talking about Generation Zers. Are they getting a bad rap? What should we expect from them? They're going to be taken over pretty soon in the workforce. They are going to be the dominant group, the dominant workforce. What should we expect from them? How should we see them? And are we seeing them through a narrow prism, or do we need to broaden that? Esther and Monique, I want to ask you this. Let me start with you, Esther. In terms of your approach in the workforce, is that based on what you've seen through your elders, or does that experience come from conversations that you have with your contemporaries? You know what I'm saying? Is it based on your experience growing up, seeing your parents or grandparents or uncles, aunts, older friends, and how they go through life in the workplace? Or is this a conversation that you all have, as Sean said, like online with your contemporaries? Help me understand how your thought process is formed, especially in terms of work balance.
I would say like I'm one of like the special cases. I'm a first generation college student. So my grandparents or parents, they came from America, from Haiti. So I really didn't have like, in terms of like workforce of like a person to look up to. So everything for me, like in terms of the experience of like working at a corporate company, was firsthand experience. But I was a part of many organizations, Management Leadership Tomorrow, that kind of like prepare Black and Brown students for the workspace. And I think through that organization, I was able to get that work experience that a lot of people in our generation didn't have the opportunity to. And I think that was able to like prepare me to like know how to work with older generations. Like, for example, like I'm in the office now, and most of the people that's in my team are baby boomers, millennials, Gen X. And I believe we only have like 2 Gen Zers. And how things are happening is that we're learning from each other. Like Rick, who's my office mate, he's 75, and I learn from him, but he also learns from me. And so it's like a mutual exchange of like the hip and like what usually comes and goes on in the corporate life.
Sonia, let me sort of piggyback that a little bit and even go back to what Sean had said, that, you know, college really doesn't prepare you for the workplace. One, I wanted to know your thoughts on that, if you agree, and if not, are colleges sort of adapting curriculums to better prepare students for the job market? So it's kind of a two-parter.
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think Sean is right regarding the preparation for the workplace. I believe that the internships and those opportunities, that's what prepares you for the workplace. It's like theory and the actual things that you're doing. So students are going to class and learning things, but the real learning really takes place. It's that on the job training. And we really have to meet these young people where they are. We have to learn to speak their language. We have to remember that, they weren't raised like us. They're used to speaking their minds, amplifying their voices, that peer support. They want to be free. I can tell that from my own kids. They want to be free. They want to be able to do what they want to do when they want to do it. So when it comes to the workplace, it really is that on the job training where they learn those skills of how to interact. And again, I take you back to what was said earlier about COVID, how they didn't have the opportunity to really socialize and learn those social skills. And so
that can't be underplayed, huh, Sonia? Because I could see, again, my generation and the older generation, and you kind of, talked about this earlier, where it's kind of like, look, we get the job, you get your job and you get out there and do it. You don't got to be happy about it. You don't have to love it, but get up, go to work every day. And, you get your fulfillment when you come home, not necessarily at work. But that's something, even this older generation, we have to sort of redirect our minds on this generation that has gone through COVID. And you mentioned sort of anxiety, and I've seen it, in my kids. That's real. How do we get sort of us, the next generation, to be more accepting and understanding of that? I don't know if there's one answer for that, so I'm not asking you to...
There's not one answer.
I know it's a rhetorical question, right? Yeah.
Yes, but I think it really is. We have to be open-minded. We have to be willing to listen. A lot of times we just want to tell the young people what to do. They have good ideas. We have to be willing to listen and be open to their ideas. We have to realize that they have to learn. My own daughter tells me, you work so hard. I saw you work 2-3 jobs. I'm not trying to do that. They have more of a purpose-driven life of things that they want to do. And, they get validation from their peer group. So as employers, I think that it's very important to, again, meet them where they are. We have to realize that there's so much going on that they adjust to. They really think about climate change. They think about, the global unrest. They think about, future pandemics, and those sort of things really cloud their minds because they've lived through it. They're dealing with it, and they think about how this generation is not protecting their future. So when they go to work, yes, they really need that support from this generation to really teach them, but you have to be open-minded in the way that you work with the Gen Zers.
Sean, I think the operative word that Sonia used there was support. Are there ways that companies can create a more supportive environment for these young employees entering their, at least, especially their first jobs, while not feeling like, they're coddling these people who they've hired and paid to do a job?
I think there's definitely some work on the infrastructure, but even before that, just kind of taking a step back. And I think all generations kind of got to get their head right on this. And the reality of this, and this is something that Gen Z is beyond us on. So the fact that the previous generations can kind of scoff at these things is because there was a different social contract back then. Okay. So most baby boomers could expect to get a job. Some of them didn't even need to have a high school diploma. You could get a decent factory job at, with an 11th grade degree or something like that. That job, you could work your 40 hours a week, get your overtime if you wanted it. You could buy yourself a well-priced home, put your kids through college, pay for your daughter's wedding, even take a vacation once a year on one income. That's what most baby boomers were raised with, that world. But over the course of the last 30, 40 years, all the promise of innovation kind of met good old unbridled capitalism, right? And so we saw that more and more people were asked to do more and more work while their peers were getting let go. So now your one job that you used to get done in 40 hours, you're now doing two people's jobs. And the fact is that contract that said, okay, if I get to the end of this road here, I'm going to get a gold watch and a nice pension. Pension? Who still has pensions? I don't even know if Esther and Monique know that pensions used to exist, you know? And so now it's, oh no, you go do a 401k and hope that it gets
do some kind of matching, right? Yeah.
If you get lucky, and hopefully you don't have an Enron situation happen. And so I think we got to check ourselves and say, okay, the contract has changed. Nobody's guaranteeing anybody employment for the rest of their life. So that loyalty that baby boomers could afford to have, there was a payoff at the end that no longer exists for Gen Z. The other thing is they have different outlooks on things. Like when I was in school or going through college, I had plenty of friends that took advantage of the Marion Barry Youth Jobs Program. Again, another place where children were being socialized into how things happen in the workforce and giving them an opportunity to brush shoulders with previous generations. You know, a lot of those things were cut. But another thing is when I was growing up, it was embarrassing to be living at home after a certain age. It was a pride thing, right? And I can't say one is good or bad, but Gen Z doesn't necessarily see it that way. And Gen Z doesn't necessarily see it as, okay, I want to work and do this, this, and that. And then when I'm 75 years old, like maybe your office mate, I can finally, you know, start to sit back. And so instead of kind of scoffing at Gen Z, we have to understand that there might be something to some of the things that they're saying, right? That we, as Generation X, we never really had the guts to stand up to our parents the way that perhaps Gen Z does, right? And so I've always believed, yes, there's a lot of entitlement and things like that that we tag Gen Z with, which might be accurate, but they have an audacity that comes with that entitlement, which I think just might save us all, especially with things like that and climate change and labor and all of that.
Monique, do you see your generation as a generation that will speak their mind, that will speak up, that has a certain sense of audacity where you're not really afraid to be in the workplace, to be in the classroom? Now, I've like Sean, I've been an adjunct professor, probably like Sonia as well. So I've seen how students, it's vastly different than when I was a college student, that you all will challenge a professor, which is a good thing, I think, in a way. But then you can take that in the workplace. So do you see that as part of the personality of your generation, sort of in a broad sense?
Yes. As we know, generations are defined by a lot of the social events within their time period. And if you look at it, we have been on the forefront of a lot of social movements, especially the Black Lives Matter movement, with events such as Trayvon Martin, and a lot of just social unrest within the past decade. Gen Z has been at the forefront of those movements. And I think just socially, we just have a different mindset because we can't keep accepting the same things over and over and over again and expecting different results. And I think Gen Z has been, you know, a lot of the shakers and movements in regards to those movements. I would say with, I'm kind of like a weird Gen Zer because I feel like I still align kind of with the millennials because I'm right at the beginning of being a Gen Z. And then there's like people in Gen Z that are like 11, 12 years old. And I like talk to like some of my nieces and nephews or like their friends. And I'm just like, I don't know like what they're talking about. So I'm kind of like in a weird space. Gen Z definitely, let me speak for myself, but I often find myself in the workplace and I'm like, oh, like you can't say that, like my bad. So it's just like, I mean, it's kind of just like a thing of like, okay, well, everybody was thinking it. So it's just like, Gen Z is the type we're going to say it. And it's just like, a lot of times those things need to be put on the table because I feel like the generation before us, they kind of had like taboos, like, oh, girl, you can't, like, just keep it quiet. Like, you can't do that. But it's just like Gen Z is just like, okay, well, why not? A lot of the
That
times the things aren't necessarily disrespectful, but we just have, I would just say, a boldness to us that like sometimes you do need to say things in order to get the things that you want. Closed mouths don't get fed.
uh-oh.
I would say that there was a comment that Gen Z doesn't necessarily have effective communication, but I will also put that on the older generation as well, because a lot of times I would say that there is a culture in the workplace that is just baptism by fire. Like you don't necessarily know that you're doing something wrong until you do it wrong. And I think that's just a thing that, okay, well, I did this wrong, and you kind of get like a tongue lashing in a sense, and then you just be like, okay, but Gen Z is the kind of the ones that we're going to push the tail and be like, okay, so we didn't have any clear expectations coming into this, so what exactly did you expect? Like, you can't be upset with me for doing something wrong if you don't lay out strict and clear guidelines for me to be successful to begin with. And I think that's just
comment on that. I'm sorry, Monique. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead. I thought
go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think you make a great point there. And again, going back to traditional organizations that had a certain way of, say, like you said, communicating, you know, sometimes you have to meet people where they are. So if I'm a baby boomer and I expect the only way that I communicate is through email, you know, well, a lot of Gen Z, unless they have that work email on their phone, that's probably not the best way to reach them, right? And so you need to think about, again, as you mentioned before, just think about the infrastructure. And I looked at those things you talked about, unprofessional, unorganized, and communications. To Monique's point, I think it's okay, we'll set the expectation. So like we just talked about, I might show up with no tie. And now a lot of people wear sneakers with their suits. Is that unprofessional? I don't know. And we've always all heard the term, well, if you're on time, you're late. Well, how do you know that, right? So again, to Monique's point, if we haven't set these expectations, and we all know there are just so many unwritten rules out there that we've never thought about if they make sense or not. And then we don't necessarily convey them to Gen Z, as Monique was saying. And then we get mad when they can't read our minds or understand. But at the end of the day, as I said from the beginning, is, you know, the organizations have to change. Gen Z ain't going nowhere. And so the organizations that from a communication standpoint start to think about, okay, where do I meet people where they are? Maybe we start using WhatsApp or use text messages if people are comfortable with that, or what have you. And then again, when it comes to professionalism and organization, the interesting thing about those things is typically those aren't the things you should be firing people for anyway. I mean, those are all coachable things, which goes back to the whole piece about a lot of times they just need mentors. And so what most organizations have begun doing is really, you know, managing people through metrics. So it's say, you know what, I need you to make, 10 widgets a week, and then stepping back and giving people the autonomy to figure out how to get those 10 widgets made at the end of the week. And as long as those 10 widgets are made, then I don't care, what you dress like, what form of communication. And so there's a flexibility and a focus on what matters that's going to need to come from organizations if they want to be successful in navigating this transition of generations.
And just to finish my point, I think also Gen Z just has a different expectation in regards to boundaries. One thing that I've done personally to enforce those boundaries is I have turned off my work email notifications on my personal phone. I would look at it during work hours, but after work hours, I'm not getting paid after 5:01. So I will not be looking at those emails until 8:30 tomorrow. And, a lot of times I think the older generation has kind of built in work into their identity. And we do not do that. And I think I can see within our generation a lot of that elitism being broken down, because your title doesn't necessarily matter within Gen Z. We go to work, to make an income. Work is not who I am, which is, I guess, a part of that disconnect, because the older generation, they're like, okay, well, I've worked at this organization for 30, 40 years, and that makes me this high prestige person. And because I'm this high prestige person, I have this stellar work ethic. And because your generation doesn't want to work, then it's just like, okay, well, I'm like, I just need to pay my bills. Like that's why I'm here. I do find some passion in the things that I'm doing, but college is not necessarily about passion or, finding yourself, because a lot of times work is not, what you're passionate about. Some people are lucky enough to find passion within the things that they do, but personally, myself, I'm, trying to find something especially within this economy, that I can see myself doing that is going to make me the money, because rent, you can't get under $2,000 in
Well,
this.
that's just the problem all across the country, but especially here in the DC area. Sonia, Monique has, hit a lot of things there. And what struck me was what she had said a little earlier when she said, when we were talking about Gen Zers speaking up, speaking their mind, saying what's on their mind, and maybe sometimes not always in the most appropriate time. And I can just say, again, as teaching college students, I've had that issue at times where you feel like you have to help them understand time and place. I would say that's one of my big experiences, if I can speak broadly, of dealing with Gen Zers, is sort of helping them understand time and place. Not every time and every place is appropriate for you to say kind of what you want to say. So do you see, and Monique mentioned this, do you see gaps in terms of whether it's employers, whether even if it's parents, as we're talking, some of us older folks here on the panel, in terms of expectations and the perceptions, let's just say, of the workplace for Gen Zers? I know we kind of hit on that, but it just really struck me when Monique was talking about kind of what you say, when you say it, and Gen Zers are more apt to just say it. Yeah, speak their mind. So is that a parental thing, or is that something that we just have to live with? Because I can tell you that's a difficult one for me. It just really is.
I think that, it is very difficult as a parent. It is very difficult as an employer. And I know Monique said she doesn't feel that it's the communication piece, but it really is communication. I think that Gen Zers, they need to feel valued. They need to feel included. They need to feel empowered, because that's their generation. She mentioned how they're on the front lines. They need to feel that, at work for them, it's not just about the professional development. It's about the personal development. And I really think that when you consider that most Gen Zers really value self-care, it's not that they're selfish. They value self-care, and they want to make sure that the life that they live, as Sean mentioned, they're not about that life of working until they're 75. They want to make sure that they live life now, and work is just a way to pay for that. As Monique mentioned, it's about being able to pay for things. It might not be their passion. If they can find a job that is their passion, that's wonderful. But in the economy that we live in, it is difficult. So I think, again, and Sean's mentioned it, I've mentioned it, we have to meet them where they are. We have to know that, yes, they're different. Each generation is different, but it's more important to meet them where they are. I like what Sean said earlier when he said that, this is the future workforce. It's now. It's not even future, it's now. And so we have to consider that. And so we really do have to make sure that we are mentoring them, that we allow them, that open and honest communication is what's going to be so important in relating to this generation. We have to be open and honest. And we also have to take a look at ourselves and recognize when we are wrong, because we're not always right. So we have to recognize that as well, especially in the workplace.
Oh. We want to be right, though, Sonia.
We want to be, but we're not always right.
Okay. Esther, you're you're very, very new 2023 grad. So I don't know how much you can reflect back, since you're so really new into the workforce, but was there any specific kind of support or mentorship that you wish you had or hope to have as you're starting your career or started your career? Anything that you long for in terms of mentoring? Esther?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. In terms of like mentorship long for, I don't think so, because for me, I was a very like involved student in terms of like in undergrad, in terms of like doing internships. I had internships every summer. I was a part of several organizations that kind of like connected me. I was a huge networker. That's how I got my job. So I wouldn't say I lacked anything. If anything, I think maybe I lacked maybe
If
the
there was
interaction of like
interaction
working with
with,
other
yeah.
peers.
Yeah,
That's
that.
amazing, though, Esther.
Yeah,
It's great to hear.
because I was gonna ask you that, Sean. I was gonna kind of follow up on that. Do you think even remote work has impacted Gen Zers in their preparedness and performance in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And someone like Esther, just doesn't come along as often as you think. A person that has taken the initiative to go and do the internships. Most college students, unfortunately, don't think about work until like that last semester, and I got to do something after that. So the Esthers of the world are, several steps ahead of them, and all of us are competing for the Esthers of the world. But essentially, I think what she's saying is spot on, and it warms my heart to hear young people such as yourself undertaking and really just showing the initiative for that, because that initiative is a transferable skill that we hear, in the corporate world, that says, okay, this is a person that without a playbook got up off the couch and said, this is what I want, and I'm going to go get it. And so those are the things that make people say, okay, this is somebody, we can train, we can coach, and we can put them in a position that can help us influence things.
As we prepare to close out, and I'll start with you, Sean, are there any resources our listeners or viewers can go to, can use, whether it is Gen Zers, whether it's employers who are trying to figure out how to work with the next generation, any places they can go, websites they can use?
Definitely. So from the Gen Zers that are in school or coming out of school, if you're trying to figure out what you want to do, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out something called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and it's exactly what it sounds like. And you can go and you can actually see the labor trends that are forecast. So it'll say this job is projected to grow 20% over the next 10 years, or this job's expected to dive, that sort of thing. So it'll give you an idea of what vocations are primed for growth and which ones aren't. The beauty of it is they also have this little section in there that talks about really the nature of the work, right? So it'll say something like, you're expected to be in an office and long office days or this or that, depending on what the job is. So you can get a little bit of some insight from that. But what you can also do is informational interviews. So there's a lot of stuff on LinkedIn where you can talk to people and they'll give you insights into the actual workplace. Because again, we're making a distinction, Sonia and I are, between the skills you need from work and actually being prepared to exist in the workplace. And then on the other side, from the organizations, what a great thing to do is to create what are called employee resource groups. You typically see them for, you might have for females or African Americans or people with kids or stuff like that. And you really should have one of those for Gen Zs. You really need to make sure you are actively going after that group to get their opinions on things, so you could start cultivating the specifics of your work environment so that you're a favorable place for those people to want to come work.
Great advice. Dr. Sonia Ford, Wellness Center Director at a major university. Sean Talley, HR expert. Monique Small, a Gen Z college graduate. She's been in the workforce almost 4 years, and I'm absolutely sure we will continue her success. And Esther Alexandri, a 2023 graduate, and she's out and working in the world right now. We thank you all for being with us. Very important conversation. Learned a lot. When you're the host and you can learn, that's always a great thing. Hopefully all of you out there watching and listening have done the same. That's the Daily Drum for this Thursday, October 3rd. I'm Bramante Bryant in for Harold Fisher. Have a great night.